which she has not been able to fix and probably can't fix. So let's start off with what she's doing right before we get to the problem, which is the thing that undermines, I think, it all. She's got three basic pillars. The first pillar I would say is fix the rules. The 2021 election collapsed in part because the rules were unclear and or contested. She needs to have a clear constitutional basis for the elections and clear definition of what the parliament and what the president each, what the authority of each is going to be. And in particular, she's got to work through the eligibility criteria. We can't have a situation where if a Gaddafi is running or a Haftar is running, for example, the elections get canceled because it's simply too fraught. Yes, it's going to be fraught, but they have to work out eligibility enough ahead of time so that you don't have another last minute cancellation. There needs to be some kind of agreed upon mechanism for settling disputes with the courts, maybe in courts, and acceptance that what the courts say is going to determine what's going to happen next. So without having done that, you have a situation where this election is no good because I lost. That's why it's no good, I lost. And there's always going to be losers and more losers than winners, potentially. So that's the first, is fix the rules, and she's trying to do that. She's had broad consultations to begin to set this process in motion. And that's very, very positive. The second thing she's trying to do is fix the institutions, not just the rules. So she needs new people in place in the High National Elections Commission. And they have to have enough money so that they know they can do what they need to do. They can't be contingent on the largesse of the Debeba government, for example, or the HOR on the other. They have to have buy-in from Tripoli and from Benghazi and the East. They're all saying ready to go. And again, judiciary has to be empowered to make the decisions that are not corrupt, and that will be abided by others and will be accepted as this is the court that decides, and we accept that court's decision. And the malicious cannot be in a situation. We can't be in a situation where malicious can go and overrun a court or detain a judge, or otherwise exercise their influence in such a way to undermine judicial independence. And she's grappling with that. So these are things she is grappling with in her roadmap, which is pretty astonishing because it's very hard stuff. It's not easy stuff. She's serious about it. So I'm going to give her a series of A's for ambition and A's for scope and A's for systematic before we get to the one thing, which I'm not sure she could take on, which is unfortunately going to be a zero next to the hundreds. I'm anticipating where we're heading. I want you all to anticipate where we're heading and why I'm so pessimistic despite her excellent work. The third is fix the process. So she's not just going to the dinosaurs and the spoilers. She's trying to have municipalities, women, youth, civil society, every component consulted and thereby buying in to her basic roadmap. And when the reason she's got all of this support in part, I think, is people see someone who's being systematic and inclusive. And she's secured the international backing, and international banking is absolutely essential. And I think the past failures were because one or more, and in some cases, all three of these pillars were not done. For example, when Jan Kubiš was in charge, he basically said, I'm going to let Aguila do it. Aguila will do it. That's all I have to do. And of course, that didn't work because Aguila in the end didn't want to give up power. And now we're going to get to the zero, having I've just very quickly detailed out what I thought she's done brilliantly conceptually. And the zero is that she has to, in the absence of a very, very strong international consensus, which does not exist. I'm going to get back to that in a moment as my final thoughts in this introductory response. She can rely on Aguila in the House of Representatives. She has to rely on the High State Council. She has to rely on the Haftar. She has to rely on Debeba. Which of those characters actually wants elections? None of them do. And yet those are the very people she has to rely on to get there at this point, unless she can mobilize civil society more broadly, which in turn would require united support from the internationals that they really want elections and really want a new group. And in the absence of a terrorist crisis or an economic collapse, or no water, some kind of massive crisis, You're not gonna get that. You then get who are the status quo powers at this point, and that's changed over time. But right now, Russia and Turkey, who ostensibly are on opposite sides in security terms, in reality, they're both backing the Haftar camp and the Debeba camp. I was talking with Hafad about this a little bit earlier today directly, and this incorporates some of his thinking, I think it's fair to say. Turkey has moved to the point where it's guaranteeing Debeba rather than trying to get rid of him. So you look at the deal that was just done to get the Rada out, in theory at least, we'll see what happens in practice over time, of its revenue streams and power from control of Matiga Airport. That's Turkey. Everybody says it's Turkey. So if Turkey is supporting Debeba staying in place, and if Debeba and the Haftar are sharing revenues and sharing power, how does that stack up against Tata's roadmap? I think it's one is to feed everybody, and the other is the reality, which is consolidation of status quo. So I think we're at a point where while the UN is doing everything right, the UN as an institution and the UN processes as an institution are far weaker than they used to be, and the status quo powers are stronger. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you've already started touching on the security point, which is where I wanted to bring you in, Tarek. Of course, a lot of these political arrangements that we are talking about are going to depend on the security realities on the ground. Jonathan has already touched on this. We saw the deal that Turkey brokered with the Rada force, transferring the airport control, moving prisons to the Attorney General. Is this the kind of security progress that could actually support the political roadmap, or are we just seeing, militia control reshuffle under new arrangements? What's your take on this?
Thanks so much, and thanks a lot for inviting me to be here. I think it's being sold as the kind of progress that we would all like to see. But I think a better analogy for it is, if you look at the general situation in Libya and the status quo as being a car, Turkey and others really need for it to get to its destination. And so deals like this is kind of just, slapping on a patch here and there to try and keep the whole thing together because they need it to keep going. But I fear really it is all going to fall apart one day. To dig into a bit more detail here with this particular deal, you have a broader situation whereby Debeba is trying to actively centralize more control and centralize more power, and he's using the threat of war to do so, except he doesn't actually have a force under him that he can directly control. And so he is actually using the threat of an indeterminate length of violence right in the heart of the capital and the effects which that will have in order to bring in Turkey and others just to try to keep the peace. Now, on paper, the deal looks great. The Rada, the SDF, they move out of the civilian section of Maitiga Airport. You get a bit more of an official-looking military. But once you look at some of the steps involved and some of the stages, you can see the hiccups that are coming. And a major one of this is Rada surrendering some of the big commanders who they are providing safe haven to. Osama Najim, who was famously wanted by the ICC and was returned from Rome earlier this year, and Osama Tlish, who was a senior commander under the force which Debeba executed or cut the head off of earlier this year. Now, if Rada actually goes ahead with the deal as it's written down, then you're going to start to see fractures within that broader militia organization itself because, rivalries between these existing militia leaders and the fact they no longer feel safe or capable of trusting one another means that they will start turning on one another. So whilst the military institutions are still hybridized in this way, and we do have a collection of militias who are effectively, just in alliances of mutual convenience, then unfortunately, the threat of future conflict or future war always hangs over things.
Thank you, Tarek. Tim, let me bring you in on the economic front. Of course, there's some interesting kind of signs that are maybe surprising that are coming from the Libyan economy recently. Libya just hit a 12-year high in oil production, 1.3 million barrels per day, despite the political situation that we have talked about and the security instability that Tarek has described. How do we square this? Does the economic performance like this make a political settlement sort of more likely or less likely?
Many thanks, Intisar, and thank you for this kind invite. And great to see everybody, so many friends in the room, and a lot of expertise. So I think this is a really interesting question. On the political front, we hear about a lot of uncertainty, the potential for conflict. But the economy, like you say, is it showing some kinds of green shoots? How should we interpret that? I guess my way of answering that would be that what we have seen really over the last 4 years or so is some kind of elite consensus over how the economy is utilized. Put simply, I think that the flow of funds in the Libyan system has changed. Previously, it used to be that the NOC predominantly in the East would lift the oil, sell the oil internationally, and that the funds would be received through and into the central bank in Tripoli, and everybody would argue over how those funds would be distributed. What's changed in the ensuing period is that the threat of blockades and the shifting power dynamics between the Dbeibas in Tripoli and the Haftars in the East have led to a kind of de facto deal where they've ramped up imports of fuel, been running trades of fuel for crude, and effectively provided a route for the East to access funds directly from the oil sector, breaking that kind of interdependence that had previously been there. So this highlights kind of a problem. Yes, okay, perhaps some of the revenues are going up, but where are those revenues going? We probably have a black hole as big as $20 billion between 2022 and 2024 of unaccounted for funds, according to the Libyan anti-corruption agencies and people looking into this closely. Moreover, if we continue with Tarek's analysis or analogy of the car, well, what's under the car's hood? Where are the numbers? We don't have a budget. We don't actually have a means of knowing what the nature of the spending is. Because of that change in the oil sector, the fuel subsidies have gone off the books. And although theoretically, of course, Libya is supposed to be spending 1/12 of its previously agreed budget, nobody agrees on what the previously agreed budget was. And also, nobody is able to follow that. So what we've seen is likely a massive expansion of spending, but nothing's really coming out the other end. So finally, if we were to look at this from the perspective of the Libyan people, would you say that this increased production or revenues potentially from the oil sector is making a difference? Well, you wouldn't. It's very clear that public services are deteriorating rapidly. They are crumbling. Good luck finding access to subsidized goods. And the key measure for this, of course, is the strength of the dinar in the black market, which has reduced significantly. We've seen the government have to, or the CBL have to devalue recently and take measures to address some of these problems. So whilst there are some things which look promising, the overall kind of fundamentals still look pretty shaky. And even if we were to look at things like the development sector, where the Haftar family would like to suggest that they are running extensive redevelopment and reconstruction projects, those projects are running outside of the oversight of the state. We don't know what the revenue sources are for those funds. We certainly don't know how they're being accounted for. So the books are messy, and we can also see that there are shortages in terms of what the elite alliances are kind of able to spend. And we can spot this because we can see increasingly bitter struggles over control of state institutions, most recently in the telecom sector with the Libyan Post and Information Technology Company. So ultimately, whilst the amount of oil that's being lifted is perhaps increasing, the money is being spent on maintaining these elite alliances in a way that's really unsustainable. So that raises the question of how long that can go on before we see actually flashpoints. And here I would say that perhaps the flashpoints that we've seen earlier this year, for example, with the killing of Abdel Ghani al-Kikli, known as Gnewa, is reflective of the GNU's attempts to try and wrest control back of institutions and access to budgets. And so, as we move forward, these political deals in the security sector, in finding a way forward politically, will also be heavily contingent upon satisfying the demands of these elite constituencies for access to resources. And I think ultimately, that's something where the desire and demand is much greater than the supply, so creates a real sustainability problem.
So, terrific, Tim. Thank you so much. You've all kind of already started to dig into how the dynamics are really shifting, and I want us to go a little bit deeper into that. Jonathan, you've spoken about sort of Turkey's changing position. You've spoken about the international consensus and all of the sort of changing positioning of different actors, etc. There's been some very interesting kind of diplomatic choreography also that sort of underpins this. The surprise visit in Rome between Dbeibeh, Saddam Haftar, and Boulos as well. Turkey, as you mentioned, courting the East after years of backing the West. So explain how these are changing the foundation of the political debate.
I think there's a move towards pragmatism and towards instead of an international community, which is a phrase I've always hated anyway, because it obscures more than it reveals. But there are times when the internationals come together, and Skhirat was a good example, in pursuit of a common objective. And the reason that happened then, and it's relevant to the present moment, which is why I'm bringing up from 10 years ago, is the Islamic State had taken over Sirte, bisected the country, and were executing Egyptians on the beach, and generally creating a situation that was untenable. It was bad for everybody to have an extremely radical, vicious terrorist group controlling territory in Libya. It was scary. And I personally believe Skhirat would not have happened without that. I think that caused everybody to say, can't tolerate this, got to get a government in place. By contrast, right now, you've got Gaza, Israel, you've got Ukraine, Russia. And where's the civil war in Libya? They seem to be able to manage things reasonably well as long as the various power brokers get their share. Indeed, we even hear reports that the Haftars and Dbeibeh, arch enemies, are cooperating with one another and dividing up revenues and mechanisms for survival and for flourishing. And that maybe Ibrahim Dbeibeh, who sometimes is characterized as a power behind the throne, and Saddam Haftar communicate with one another in various ways and work out deals. So in that environment, it favors powerful status quo actors to build on what they have and to freeze out change. And so the Boulos initiative, the question is he looking for something that's going to be a face saver in which there's some figurehead who winds up being the unified expression of the nation that they all can support, or whether they just continue with the maybe having his thing, the Haftars having their thing, and deferring the fight until later. And it seems to me that's the current dichotomy. And Boulos is basically operating according to a big man approach to diplomacy, which is a very efficient, inadequate, but efficient way of going about diplomacy, which is you deal with the big, powerful guys, you broker your deals with them, you don't worry about anything else. And you figure out what your interests are. The US interests are commercial, getting contracts, getting oil, more into the oil business. American companies are coming in now, right? So there's that. They certainly don't, the United States doesn't want to see the country fall apart again into open civil war, but that doesn't seem to be about to happen. So if you look at it from that perspective, Willis is there to explore whether perhaps he can help President Trump get a Nobel Prize for solving the Libya crisis, in addition for the other 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 that he's solved. I can't keep track of all of them, forgive me. I'm not.
They're giving birth to each other.
I'm not good with numbers in that way, but he's clearly there as a member of the Trump family. To deliver victories for the president. So what does the president of the United States want? He wants investment in the United States. He wants tax revenues for the United States. He wants business deals for US companies. He wants respect. And he wants the United States not to be entangled in foreign conflicts on the other side. So I think if you interpret the Boulos activities from that point of view, it explains why he's meeting with Haftar and Dbeiba, not the named Haftars, but the unnamed Haftars, the unnamed relatives, to try and see if he can get move forward in that agenda. Now, the New York Times this morning, of course, published its version of what Mr. Boulos is doing, and I have nothing to say on that point at this time. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, since we are talking about all of these deals, Tim, let me come to you. You know, there's been a number of different announcements, you know, major energy deals, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, I think something like 235 million in infrastructure engagements or investments, or however you want to call it. I'm curious, I mean, we have maybe seen a version of this kind of sort of economic forward engagement. And here I'm thinking maybe of Italy and what Italy tried to do, particularly in regards to the energy sector. You know, how does this compare? What does this mean really in terms of change on the ground? And what sort of leverage do you think this creates in terms of politics and for the political process?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess just to start by rewinding slightly, and in some ways, this is a bit of a back to the future moment in the fact that a lot of what the Libyan NOC has been seeking to achieve are the objectives that it really sought to achieve in the early mid 2000s, and to basically bolster production and, you know, privatize and expand its relationships with foreign oil companies, IOCs, etc. So this agenda is not a new one, certainly one that had stalled, and really was the principal promise of the former chairman of the National Corporation, Farhat Bengadara. And in many ways, I think it's the relative success of the tender process and the engagement of the NOC with international oil companies has been quite a surprise to many of us analysts looking at the situation from afar, but of course is also driven significantly by global events rather than necessarily improvements on the ground in Libya. The one thing that has been seized upon, I think, by these private actors is a relative absence of conflict. And in a way, I think, as Jonathan's alluded, the basis of that relative stability has been deals in the oil sector to keep the oil flowing and to ensure that that funds from the oil sector make it to the conflict actors. And in that sense, there has kind of been a benefit to the chaos, right? Without there being a budget, without there being proper oversight of the budgets of state institutions, you know, the administrative chaos of a lot of state-owned enterprises is kind of overlooked. And this is quite a perilous environment in which some of these companies are investing, but in some ways it provides a degree of certainty because they know if they're investing in the East, who they need to call if there's a problem. And similarly, there is a clear interest ahead of his killing. Gnewa was rapidly seeking to expand his influence and access to oil contracts. So this is also a scramble among the elites to get in and ensure that they benefit from these types of engagements. So it's kind of in a way a source of stability and a source of the problem. A further aspect, perhaps, that we're seeing as well is a really narrowing of these elite interests. So if we look at Eastern Libya, there isn't one state institution that isn't completely dominated by the Haftar family that has access to funds. Also, when we're talking about that promise of privatization, what we're really probably going to get is cronyism. So we only have to look at the emergence of the oil services company Arknu, which clearly has credible links to both the Dbeibas and the Haftars for its engagement in the oil sector as a kind of sign of things to come. So somewhat of a mixed picture in a way. Perhaps the certainty that these investors may have is only dependent on the maintenance of the status quo by these actors. So it creates a further set of entrenched interests, which perhaps will undermine some of the political progress. So, whilst it might seem positive and does have some positives in theory for the Libyan economy, I guess I just have my doubts that actually the benefits of these contracts will be felt by the Libyan people. And I have fears that ultimately we seem to be witnessing a rapid expansion of personal accumulation from such contracts.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Tarek, Tim spoke about sort of Eastern, kind of the relative stability on in the Eastern side, and I'm curious if we can dig a little bit more into the consolidation under Haftar family control that we are seeing. Jonathan mentioned he's positioned his sons in key military and economic roles as well. Saddam as deputy commander, others controlling different resources, etc. And then, of course, he's meeting with everyone from Turkey to France. That continues. Is this about securing kind of a smooth succession, or is it more sort of about positioning for a better kind of position for national negotiations? Or is it both?
Yeah, thank you. You asked and then answered the question for me. I think it is a bit of both, really. It's clear, Papa Haftar's health issues have been infamous for quite some time now, and they continue to get worse. And so it's clear that some kind of succession is lining up. It's not a surprise that Saddam is the one being touted as the heir. Less to do with his own personal competencies, more to do with his international partnerships, with the Emiratis, with the Russians, with other kind of important actors like the Jordanians and so on from his time helping to run guns for his father during the first civil war in 2014. Again, like with the situation in Tripoli, the talks of stability are often illusory. It's like the idea of I can't think of a good analogy. I've been sleep deprived for too long, but it will last until it is tested, essentially. So right now, while there isn't anything to rock the boat, it all looks like this perfect military dictatorship that will last as for decades at a time. But you scratch the surface, you see the weak points. I mean, the LNA now, if you would like to call it that, or the LAAF, is smaller than it was at the launch of the 2019 war against Tripoli. It used to be built on the back of Eastern Libyan and Southern Libyan tribes. Now it's built around Haftar's children as almost like a private army. It looks great in parades. They got a lot of fancy toys, and good uniforms and so on. Every time they've been tested, it leaves a bit to be wanting. Saddam expended an entire battalion, and I think 3 days just to capture one house from the former defense minister and his family holed up in it. And if you look at the Dignity Day parade, the parade that commemorates the launch of his military operation, it was held this year in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere, essentially, because of the rumbling discontent amongst Eastern Libyan tribes because of a leaked video which showed an MP, about Ibrahim Madrisi, who was kind of shackled and chained up and in the most horrific circumstances in one of Saddam's dungeons, basically begging for his freedom. And everybody knows what happens, but seeing it in your face like that was was a shocking event, even in eastern Libya. And it shows that actually, without the public support, um, the fear will only get you so far. And so, whilst everything is being laid up for a clean succession, there are questions over how it will go. It will be a moment of fragility. I mean, I think the watchword from all of this, from both what Tim and Jonathan were saying as well, is that a lot of this is an internationally maintained stability, because it provides for very lucrative opportunities. Whilst Libya is divided, whilst it is held hostage by two illegitimate governments, who are essentially ruling by decree, then there are a lot of opportunities to extract capital from the country. The cost of that is instability, and the integrity of the state and the nation, but we won't feel that cost for years to come, and then it'll be somebody else's problem.
Great, thank you, Tarek. Really great stuff. So before I ask the kind of last question on outlook and so on, I just want to make a quick reminder for our participants online that if you have any questions, you can please feel free to put them in the Q&A section or to raise your voice, to raise your hand, and we will call on you as well to ask your questions if you prefer to speak directly. So just kind of a last question that I have really for all of you. We've discussed everything, the roadmap, security arrangements, economic deals, transition planning. And I'm wondering which do you think or which do you see will have maybe a more substantial role in determining the country's future trajectory? And what should, let's say, policymakers prioritize when assessing and looking at all of these developments? So it's the same question for all of you. And maybe Tim, I start with you, and we'll kind of work our way through everybody.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I'll tackle this perhaps from the economic lens to connect it with what I was saying previously. And I guess, a through line from what I'm saying is that I see the economy as a key battleground of the conflict, if you like, and the accumulation of resources by these factions as something that's deeply problematic. And also, just as we see the challenges of establishing a new unified government, we see the problems of agreeing a budget and reintroducing checks and balances into the Libyan state system. From my perspective, there has to be some very targeted engagement for economic stabilization in Libya. I think it's very difficult for me to see how some kind of political horizon could be reached without some kind of guardrails being introduced on the extraction by these players. There are some green shoots here, which I think are actually promising. We don't hear a lot about it, but US government engagement with the central bank, focus on due diligence and limitations on access to letters of credit and looking at enhanced due diligence in those areas is actually a very, very positive thing given the Libyan state's reliance upon foreign currency. Similarly, we saw that the fuel swaps came to an end earlier this year, which is a very significant achievement, which came from subtle diplomacy. So, from my perspective, any political approach cannot get over the line as long as we're going to see the headlong competition in Libya's economy continuing. So I think that there need to be some very targeted negotiations over establishing some kind of Libyan deal which establishes a basis for spending and oversight and accountability mechanisms for that spending. My view in general is that this idea that by allowing the conflict actors to extract all the funds they like in return for not shooting each other is just not a good enough deal for Libya. And ultimately, I think that the demand and the erosion of the capacity of the Libyan state is a much greater threat down the line. So I think those interests have to be part of a negotiation. And I think that there has to be some stick as well as carrots here. So where actors do step out of line, I think that they should be subject to international processes, restrictions. We know the oil sector has many, many compliance elements. The company that was referenced by the New York Times today is present in the European Union. There are all kinds of checks and balances that should also be applied to the international aspects of these things, because there isn't one channel of diversion of Libyan state funds that doesn't have an international component. So I think that choking or at least mitigating some of these flows and reining in some of these worst excesses through some form of economic stabilization is a really necessary component for any progress. And I guess just finally, I think that the appointment of any new government, whether it's interim, elected, or both, is that there clearly has to be some kind of economic program of action laid out for that government. It cannot be the case that any new government does what the GNU did, was effectively try and turn its interim status into permanent power and immediately start entering into negotiations over economic deals that were lasting years when it was supposed to be in place only a few months. So I think that there has to be some kind of understanding about what that government should do to try and bring the checks and balances back into the expenditure of the Libyan state's funds and kind of re-establish some of this institutional capacity which has been so badly eroded. Like I say, actually, I think there are some green shoots for the CBL and the NOC, but ultimately they will never be able to be successful if they have a gun to their head to pay ultimately whatever the conflict actors demand.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Tim. Tarek?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll just kind of try to build on what Tim said and the discussion so far. I mean, Jonathan was speaking a bit about pragmatism in the approach. And yeah, I agree. It's what would be billed as a pragmatic approach thus far. But the problem with these pragmatic approaches is that you are always framed by the existing reality that's in front of you. You are trying to tweak what exists today rather than trying to build something for tomorrow. And so it's essentially, rearranging deck chairs as the Titanic sinks, and that's at best. I mean, it doesn't need much to kind of reiterate the problematic nature of both the governments in place. You know, they are unanswerable to the Libyan people. The Libyan people have rioted, I think, 3 times now since 2020 when the system was put in place, against both the Dbeibas, the Haftars, and the existing parliament, saying we want a brand new system, even burning the parliament building down, and yet they are always ignored because we see this idea as, it's a status quo. We don't have a big civil war yet, so it's functional. We can pass deals. We can get things to work. And yeah, unfortunately, we can see the corrosion that's happening to the state structures, but also the stability on the ground. I spoke a bit about the situation in Tripoli, how we had a small skirmish that went throughout the entire capital earlier this year. We are on the cusp of a much bigger war before the Turkish deal that you mentioned. But the fractures created by this military activity has meant that we have had a low level of conflict around the entirety of Western Libya throughout 2025. And eventually these divisions that go through all the towns and major cities around Tripoli will come back to the core or to the center. Similarly, in Eastern Libya, we see, well, at least the Haftars have the LNA, it's a functional military dictatorship and so on. They have had skirmishes with the Sudanese armed forces, with the rapid support forces in Sudan, with various Chadian rebel groups, with smugglers, and they've come off worse every single time, which again shows the limitations of even Haftar's forces, which are branded as more professional. I think with the current SRSG and the fact that we have a roadmap means we have a horizon. And like Tim mentioned, we do have some tools at our disposal to kind of try to limit the appeal of the status quo for the existing Libyan actors. If we can corral together enough members of the international community, I mean, like Jonathan, I don't like that term, but I don't know what else to use here, in order to actually credibly back the UN instead of trying to back this approach of, maximizing the economic potential of the current status quo. So, we can try to restrict how much the CBL can spend. And, there are legal foundations to this approach, given the legal illegitimacy of all of Libya's governing institutions right now. We could also try to limit illegal oil sales, because technically Libya's national oil company still has the monopoly on selling oil. However, a de facto reality exists now where you have oil companies being set up between the Dabaibas and the Haftars to sell oil instead. And these companies have their bank accounts in Switzerland and Abu Dhabi. The money doesn't get back to the state. And I know that memories are short, but Jonathan, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. It was less than 10 years ago where Navy SEALs were boarding oil tankers that were illicitly smuggling oil on behalf of the Haftars. Now we have diplomatic advisors who are allegedly, sending their family onto yachts where the owners of the yachts are those involved in the kind of illegal oil smuggling trade. And it shows the difference, but it can really have a big effect because oil is Libya's lifeline. And like Tim said, and I'll end on this, is the key when you look at a new unified government is to avoid repeating past mistakes. And I think that there's a lot to say politically of what a strong and a strict mandate can do. And I think that the SRSG is quite savvy in the sense that she wants to use this structured dialogue to create a kind of Libyan source of legitimization for what the guardrails of a new government will be. The problem is that Libyans lack an enforcement mechanism for their desires and for their demands. And so we return again, to the international community. The SRSG sees this. She's tried to restart the Berlin process. I think there are a few isolated states, at least amongst the Europeans that I work with and those in the Middle East, who see this. But yeah, it's about building the coalitions and building the consensus, which will still take time, both within Libya and outside. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tarek. And Jonathan, finally over to you. Which aspects, which elements do you think will have the bigger impact on the country's future trajectory, and what should be prioritized from a policymaking perspective?
If I were the SRSG right now, working with the international environment that exists and the approach being taken by the United States, by Turkey, and by Russia, for example, to maximize their self-interest, I would say to myself, I have to find ways around the big people, the big men, as it were. And the Haftars have historically alienated and angered other people interested in having power and wealth in the East, even the ones who are part of their coalition or are officers in the entity they call the Libyan National Army. So at least that's one of the names they use. It changes from time to time. In any case, I would be trying to broaden out the people I am legitimizing by who I'm talking to, elevating elevating various people representing various constituencies who are not the Speaker of the House, who are not the head of the High State Council, who are not the senior military officers in the LNA, who are not the architect of reconstruction in Derna, who are not the current prime minister of the country. And see to what extent by elevating people adjacent to the people in place, I can create greater pressure on the people in place to agree to the international processes the SRSG has put into place. So I do an outward in strategy in relationship to the individuals domestically, and thereby try to strengthen the ability of civil society, which is another suspect phrase, but I'm using it intentionally here because I think it's the only way through, other components of Libyan society to have greater influence. And since so much is being stolen or consolidated by a small number of people, just call it consolidated rather than stolen, try and take away the value judgment. A more equal distribution of assets could be attractive to everybody else. And so you build out broader constituencies. against the ones who today control the power and the wealth. And that I think would be fundamental domestically. Internationally, you have to look and see which countries are willing to move beyond the pragmatism of near-term self-interest to the greater pragmatism of not seeing a Libya collapsing again and threatened by terrorism, absolutism, dictatorship, gross corruption, economic failure, health failure, refugee crises, and so on. And to see which countries are ready to really support the UN process as opposed to give lip service to it. And there's been a lot of lip service rather than genuine support. Sanctions can be part of that. And here the important sanctions would be EU sanctions driven first rather than US sanctions first, in a reversal of history. Because Libyans, after all, need the European companies and the European access much more than they need US access and companies. Both are nice, but they really can't manage if France and Italy, for example, were really to cut them off. So you would have to see if you could get some serious EU support for sticks as well as carrots. I'm very skeptical that you can. Now, I agree with everything, literally everything that Tim had to say, and everything that Tarek had to say, about where you would, what are some of the things you need to do. Where I annotate what they had to say, and I should think of my intervention as an annotation rather than just a different perspective, is purely the question of whether you can get internationals on enough of them on the right side or not of change as opposed to status quo. What I call pragmatism is simply preference for the status quo down to the final paroxysm amidst as everything collapses into rubble. And very often establishment powers like the United States, powers that have been in place a long time, tend to prefer what exists for a very long time over what might be. And there's a strong institutional bias in favor of that which is, as opposed to that which might be. And Tarek is quite right to say that you're missing opportunities as well as missing the magnitude of the risk if you do that. So broader group of Libyan stakeholders, broaden the international approach to include both carrots and sticks, and look at the future, not just the present. And credentialing people beyond those who are already credentialed is important in both contexts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. All right, let me broaden this discussion and bring other people questions, comments from the audience. I have to my right here, Ben Fishman. Please go ahead.
Great. Mostly agree, some questions and amendments like or footnotes, annotations. Basically, I think, Jonathan, just to clarify, the big man approach is kind of Bulos is basically contradicting what Anatata is doing, because she's trying to bypass big guys, and he's really,
or at least reduce their influence.
So
No
I
bypassing them though, I mean, she's went back and said they are the easiest way to improve things is to go back, despite the fact that she acknowledged that the population as a whole, the majority, opted for the fourth opt, which is to completely remove all of these bodies from, and then she came back and said, but we still have to work with them.
all the options reflect in various forms changing the government. And the government, it's not gonna change. So I see that as a recycling of all the problems, of the fundamental problems of all the UN process. As opposed to, I think, what the Biden approach was trying to seek an agreement with Haftar and going to him, mostly without any extracting any deals from him. And I was fundamentally critical of that approach. Now we're going to him for uh, for secure business options. And that brings me to the other question. Tim, you mentioned or alluded to the whatever Bill Hassam's investment fund is or development fund is. All these companies, especially the US companies, ultimately care about their bottom line. And it's my experience that the Libyans don't pay at the end. So how is that gonna square up? And the last point is we haven't mentioned Russia at all in the conversation. And it's hard to see them sitting by as other actors take charge. So few things.
Yeah,
Tim.
maybe, Tim, do you mind if we start with you on the question, and then Jonathan will come to you on the other aspect of Russia, and then Tarek, you can come in at the end if you have anything else to add. So Tim, over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Ben. And as I was talking, I realized perhaps I was coming across as if all of the internationals in this process need to be acting like doves. And of course, we know that the policymaking environment is, not as we might wish it, shall we say. But I think your point alludes to the fact that there's a need for enlightened self-interest here. So, sure, Belgesim might bring in some small, or in a US context, size contractors. But can they be sure that he will be continuing to be able to pay? He's asked for 69 billion dinars from the central bank. The central bank governor has said he will resign if that is provided. What is the source of those funds? What is the governance of those funds? How on earth could those US companies do their due diligence? Similarly, in the oil sector, the NOC has stopped fuel for crude swaps, but it is accruing massive debts funded by the central bank at the moment. And if you're looking for longer term relationships as an IOC, can you be sure that the NOC is going to be able to pay? In fact, it's not been paying, and there are all kinds of problems in those relationships. So clearly, if you're looking at longer term business investments, you need longer term assurances. And to get those assurances, you need the finances to be sorted out. And, that isn't going to be sorted out by a proliferation of private jets based at Benina. So I think on this front, that's why I go back to the sequencing. I think that you need to focus on reinstituting some checks and balances to create some incentive to move away from the status quo. I understand the arguments to move straight from where we are now to a process which puts all the interests at stake and moves people around. But fundamentally, I think that the problem is that that day never seems to come. So I think that some of the quite dull and not headline making incrementalism to try and reinstitute checks and balances is probably the hard yards that needs to be done, but is not a particularly heavy lift. We've seen that the Treasury has been able to have quite an outsized impact on the CBL with relatively little engagement. So I think some of those things shouldn't be underestimated. And then if internationals seek business deals that they can make mutually beneficial with the Libyan state, then I think that's a very different proposition. And ultimately, Libya will need international investment. So I don't think that this interest is all bad by any stretch. I just think that the operating environment isn't conducive to make it work, let alone as good business investments, let alone as things that deliver strong returns.
Jonathan, on the question of US approach, potentially undermining the SRSG's approach?
I think the focus on deals with big men who don't have legitimacy from the Libyan people, but rather have ratcheted up their own authority and power through deals with the internationals is a mistake, as I've already described. There's a huge lever which Tim has just remarked on, which is the constitutional requirement that all money be from oil go to the central bank, which was circumvented in the oil barter period. If the United States, for example, and Europe and the UK were quite serious about the monitoring of all transactions involving oil in Libya, and quite insistent that all the revenues go in, and be prepared to sanction or even indict diversions, that would create a very different situation. The unity of the oil and the ability to track Libyan spending through having all oil revenues go through an entity which in theory can be monitored is, I think, foundational to any sustainable revenue sharing approach for Libya that involves true revenue sharing across the country. I mean, ideally, you want every individual family to have a stake in Libya's revenue, the way the Alaska natives have a stake in oil revenue in Alaska. They each get some money. You want every municipality to be getting a share of the revenue, to be able to provide services and then be held accountable by their constituents, in addition to having one national government getting money with perhaps some a formula for ensuring that the money goes east, west, and south in a way that's fair per capita in terms of Libya's needs. That would be a governance system, leaving elections aside for a moment. Right now, it's a pipe dream. You can describe it. It can emerge from the pipe with a description. After that, it's just going to be blown away by the wind. So the United States has no such policy of the kind that I've just described, and indeed during the Biden years failed to use the power that it had in any significant way on the sanction side or on insisting unification. Tarek was quite right. We sent the SEALs in once to stop a diversion of oil, and we threatened to do it a second time with an India flagged vessel. And instead of our needing to do it, the Indian government solved the problem because they didn't want the specter of the United States putting military aboard an Indian flagged ship. So the United States has got a lot of tools if it wants to use them. The United States unified with the EU has even more tools, if you include the UK as well, and you could. You would still have to find things in it for China, and you would have to figure out how to manage your Russia problem. Can't do that while Russia and Turkey are happy with and bolstering the status quo. And the Biden administration squandered its opportunity. The first Trump administration essentially subcontracted its policy out largely to the Emiratis. And now they have their this new theory, which is deal with the big men to get economic profit and value for the United States. It may do that, but it risks everything else. So I quite agree with Tarek on that. I've just described the tools. I just don't expect any of them to be used.
Tara?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the Russia framing, it gives us a kind of new perspective to look at this. And I agree with what Jonathan said in the sense that this game is not set up in the USA's favor right now. I mean, if you look at the kind of playing field in Libya, it has been built this way very carefully over 10 years now by the Russians. I mean, this model of dividing up oil, the precedent for it was the Sochi oil deal in 2020. You have the Russians who are kind of trying to play both sides. And they've had a kind of long, steady growth within the country. All of the LNA's major military air bases or military bases are run by the Russians. They have their staff. They use them as if they are their own air bases, and they use them for their own Africa operations. You have the Turks running something similar. And I think that the Turks are kind of trying to sucker in the US and others like the Italians into playing their game and saying, look, if we bring enough of you guys together, we can create the inertia to found new energy deals. And some of these will be offshore. So, even if Libya goes to hell, it's not really going to affect us. But, the United States here is a bit part player in somebody else's game. So if the US really wants to pursue its own interests as the kind of protagonist, then I think its only bet is to try to reshape the battlefield or the playing field away from this current model of pockets of stability and pockets of kind of enforcement amidst a wider sea of kind of chaos and lawlessness, and invest in a political process to kind of move towards a sovereign, legitimate government, and then try to found something new on top of that.
Perfect. Thank you, Tarek. We have one question from our online audience. But maybe, Tarek, if I can just have a quick follow-up on Russia and Russia's role. You mentioned Russia as a staging ground for some of the, you mentioned Libya, pardon, as a staging ground for some of the other African operations and Russia's involvement in the continent. Has there been an uptick in presence since the fall of Assad, or since the fall of Assad in Syria? Or have kind of the number of forces sort of remained kind of the same?
It's a good question, actually. I mean, in December of last year, when Assad kind of surprisingly fell, there was this kind of big uptick, both in ro-ro vessels taking military trucks and tanks and so on to Tobruk, but also flights taking equipment. And then I think as the Russians found their feet in the new Syria, this kind of tailed off. But the fact that Libya is considered the safe place for Russia in the region says a lot, that it was the first port of call. You know, they didn't take this equipment back to the mainland. They took it to Libya because Libya is the kind of heartland of their broader Africa operations. And yeah, it's their safe space. So I think despite them finding their feet in Syria, you're still looking at more developments of Libya. They've brought in Belarus and they're working with the Belarusians to develop the Tobruk port further. And yes, then you still see regular flights coming into Jufra, which is in central Libya, and to Benghazi. I mean, sources suggest that much of this equipment these days moves onwards, either to Sudan, the Central African Republic, Niger, or Mali. But that's because, yeah, there is no active conflict in Libya yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the question of USAID, I put it up so that everybody has a chance to read it, but let me read it up. What, if any, impact do you see on the dismantling of USAID on the US and international community's influence on enabling more effective and meaningful participation of civil society, grassroots, in terms of their role in the roadmap or UN process, and then, of course, on combating corruption and promoting transparency? So for this question, I'll come to you, Jonathan. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, the US supported those kinds of programs for years, not at a heavy level. It was pretty light in terms of what the United States did. What it did was useful, but the utility should not be overstated either. It was useful on the margins. It created some opportunities for younger people and women as constituencies to begin to engage more. And so it was helpful, but it wasn't a Marshall Plan. Even in the human rights area, it was relatively small. And in some cases, because of the instability on the ground, the absorption capacity of Libya to take advantage of it was not great. When I came into my job in 2014 on Libya, I was impressed by the number of different international initiatives that have been undertaken to help Libya and their widespread failure. In many cases, complete failure to actually get much done on the ground, not because of failures on the part of the delivering agencies, because it included the Italians, the French, the EU, the Germans, the Turks. It was not just the Brits. It wasn't just the United States. So you can't blame anybody, other than to say that Libya proved quite resistant to that kind of help, except on the margins. And on the margins in particular cities for particular organizations, it definitely helped, but transformative it was not. And I don't think that was a failure on the donor side particularly. So it's not a good development. It's bad. It limits future opportunities because one of the things that USAID is it's a trick bag for an ambassador to be able to, when something, a need arises, that's a felt need within the country, to say, okay, I've got this money, it's been allocated, I can now apply it to this. Some of which is long-term, some of which is medium-term, some of which is short-term. And that's gone, and that's damaging to US foreign policy all over the place, and certainly including in Libya and North Africa.
Great. Tim and Tarek, maybe you guys can speak more broadly about kind of where civil society is right now and where they're more effective, even kind of on the margins. Tim?
Sure. So I think Tarek may touch on this a little more, but I mean, as we've been characterizing this growth of, elites, kleptocracy across the country, that's been mirrored by a growing sense of impunity by these leaders, by armed factions. And a key part of that impunity has been developed by effectively targeting civil society, targeting dissent through false claims and arbitrary detention, the passing of legislation which effectively outlaws civil society actors from working with international partners. So one of the problems has been that really the international community hasn't done much, or the internationals haven't done much to stand up for that participation. And so they have presided over really a period where that civil society voice has been extinguished in many key debates. So I think that is a clear problem. And when you're looking at broadening the political process, protecting those who are engaged is also a challenge. Just want to pick up on the second clause of the question as well by Sterling. I think that it wouldn't surprise you to learn, given what I've said throughout this discussion, that I think the corruption space is deeply important, and the anti-corruption agencies of the Libyan state are critical. They are imperfect, to say the least. They are divided. But actually, I think that this should be a clear place to continue to provide support, because the information that we do have about many of the activities that we've talked about or alluded to emanate from the Audit Bureau in particular. And so there is an effort for the Audit Bureau and the National Anti-Corruption Commission to come together, releasing a strategy next week of task forces to look at specific topics and coalesce their efforts on key issues such as fuel smuggling. I think that's something that should be supported by the international community. And whilst the international appetite perhaps for a completely different approach, a more enlightened approach towards Libya, is not going to be forthcoming, providing support to those efforts, providing international partnerships to uncover and push back against some of these behaviors is actually, I think, a really important enabling action to help improve the status quo. And the fact that USAID is not engaged as it was with the agencies before, I think is a real shame. Unfortunately, it's not the only one. UK support in civil society has been reduced, but I do think that this anti-corruption area is something that should continue to be a focus for the remaining resources.
Tarek, any thoughts on this particular issue?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add on a couple of points. I mean, civil society in Tripoli is becoming increasingly embattled as the Dbeibeh family seek to kind of emulate the Haftars and emulate their governance structures and models. I mean, even a lot of the Libyan youth who used to work with international organizations are now have been imprisoned when trying to leave the country, or have been hunted down by the Rada and some other groups and kind of imprisoned and intimidated away from their activities. And there have been a lot of legal changes. I mean, personally, as a Libyan, what I'm doing today is illegal technically. We're not supposed to engage with foreigners on these topics without express approval from the Interior Ministry. And so this kind of indicates how they are trying to close off the space for civil society. And I think the eventual, the the hope here amongst the Debeba government is to create something similar as you have in Benghazi right now, which is like an ecosystem of government approved and government sponsored civil society. So as you know, all of the diplomats who go to Benghazi, they go for these curated meetings and discussions with local civil society, which are all managed by Haftar affiliates, but nothing of political importance ever gets discussed or talked about, right? So just having it as a kind of showpiece, something you can put on the mantle is the goal there. But lastly, when civil society really comes to the fore is whenever there's a disaster. So in the aftermath of the Derna catastrophe, for the first week at least, while the NNA was scrambling like headless chickens and actually stealing more aid than delivering, it was civil society on the ground who was helping people resettle into tents, helping to recover bodies, helping to deliver aid, support hospitals, etc. And we've seen this replicated again throughout the country. There have been mass flooding incidents in a lot of places over the last year as Libya's infrastructure continues to crumble. And so, yeah, when push comes to shove, it's civil society who will step in to fill the gap left by wasted government services. But other than that, it's a very repressed space right now.
Thank you very much, Tarek. We have one more question here in the room from Sabina Henneberg. Sabina, please.
Thanks, Intisar. Thanks for all of your interventions. It's actually two questions. One sort of detailed and specific, and the other big picture. On the Teta's new plan, my understanding of her pillar about the HNEC is it's supposed to kind of make the HNEC more neutral. And I do remember from the last time we tried to have elections that there was a big fight over the rules, as you discussed, that made things fall apart, but I don't remember the HNEC being that pulled apart or sort of politicized. I was wondering if that's something that's changed and how critical that is. And then my big picture question, and I'm sorry to be bleak, but I'm sure you've all thought about it. Given, Jonathan, as you mentioned, that the ISIS control of Sirte was what brought together the international community in 2015, and given how the fundamentals underlying things like Tripoli being on the brink of war, a couple of weeks ago, haven't been resolved. If Libya were to develop into civil war now, would that incentivize the international community to really back an actual action that would change things?
Let me maybe, Tarek, I start with you just to reverse kind of the flow, and then we'll go to Tim, and then we'll come back to you, Jonathan. Tarek?
Sure. I mean, unfortunately, it's not 2015 anymore. I think the world has gotten a lot more used to bad actors and to large-scale conflicts going on in the world. And even in a geostrategic location like Libya, I don't see the international community reacting in quite the same way. Given the Europeans have their hands full with Ukraine, the United States is otherwise occupied. I think that in the case of a civil war, you would also have a lot of allies kind of mixed about in the field, including the Emiratis and the Turks, and then them mixed in with enemies like the Russians, which just complicates the whole things. And these days, complexity means that diplomats look away from the situation rather than trying to engage with it. But just to add to the bleakness, I mean, I think we do have a further problem from the jihadist groups once again. I mean, if you look down just to the Sahel, and the rise of various terrorist organizations, jihadi extremist organizations, whatever you want to call them. I mean, these groups are rapidly expanding, and one of the main anchor points, at least for JNIM, which is in Mali, is the Tuareg community, which moves between Mali, Niger, Algeria, and Libya. I mean, obviously in Algeria, they know on which side their bread is buttered, so they're not going to cause any problems there. But Libya is a real potential hotspot, especially considering the really great working relationship that these terrorist organizations have with smugglers, which help them to move around the area. So, yeah, you never have to apologize for bleakness when it comes to Libya, because unfortunately we don't have much in terms of good news. I mean, quickly on the HNEC, if we have the time. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the HNEC seems puzzling from afar. The most logic I can append to it is the idea of trying to bring political consensus into the HNEC, which might be a fool's errand. So just to explain, the HNEC did get slightly politicized. The head of the HNEC agreed to approve Aguila Salah's electoral law, which was legally incoherent and a bit of a shambles, and it was unilaterally drafted by one man, not by a parliament. And so I think in order to try to preempt that, they want to regenerate the HNEC's board. And by opening up board positions, obviously the existing political elite will stuff it with their appointees. But you then hope that you get to a situation where at least you have some political consensus at top. It might be a bit naive. It might lead to the politicization or greater politicization of what is a technocratic institution. But I think that's the logic as she tries to approach another electoral period. Thank you.
Tim?
Just on the topic of fighting, I think one thing that has been a through line is that whenever there has been an outbreak of fighting, we have seen greatly intensified international engagement. And in many ways, one of the things I've been kind of seeking to argue against is that you don't only engage when fighting takes off. So I do think that it would lead to increased engagement. I think the challenge on that front is that it would probably be quite difficult to put out. So perhaps, I don't think that a renewed episode of national fighting in Libya would look like it did in 2019 when Haftar's forces sought to march into Tripoli. I think it's a bit more like a kind of World War One set of alliances that trigger disputes where, were there an attack on the SDF, rather, then they draw upon their allies from elsewhere, perhaps Zawiya pulled in, the Zintanis pulled in, and it becomes a kind of Western conflagration that the Libyan Arab Armed Forces then seek to capitalize upon, and you could see how that could metastasize very quickly and negatively. What's also true, though, is the general multipolarity of the region, right? Each of these actors has their own international relations, and many of the meddling actors or external actors in Libya have their own agendas to pursue. We've got Turkey using Libya for Libya, but also access to the Sahel. We've got Russia doing the same. And we see that the regional players don't have the same analysis of many things. So I think it's quite telling that of the Haftar's sons, you've got Saddam being the outreach to the Americans, Khalid being the one that talks to the Russians, Belgasim handles the money and talks to others. So, it's a very, very complex environment that is then very difficult to cohere if the fighting breaks out. So I think that is remains a concern. I think this kind of miscalculation and how that would then be put out. So I do think that's a threat, but I think it would lead to international engagement. I'm just not sure whether that international engagement would make the fighting worse or actually diffuse it.
Thanks, Tim. Jonathan, over to you.
First HNEC and then what happens if fighting breaks out. HNEC was not the problem last time. HNEC went along with the UN policy. HNEC was carrying out the consensus will of the internationals, as well as the major actors in Libya. And it was a technocratic institution, had no particular way of resisting it. So I don't blame them one iota. And there was nothing wrong with it. It just didn't have a governance structure that broadened its power and appeal. So she's going to try and give it heightened legitimacy that's greater than the legitimacy of anybody else. To stop them. That's the idea, which I think is a reasonable idea. I don't know what's going to make the difference, but it's not stupid. It might even be very smart. We'll see. On the issue of fighting, the default, I believe, if there's fighting, will be to see how many of the militias they can get to accept the Haftars as being the new rulers of the country, with Turkey supporting them if there's revenue sharing with others. If they don't grab it all, but they buy off various Tripoli and Misrata militias. That would be the neat trick to do in the event of future fighting. I personally don't see trench warfare and them digging in unless it's badly mismanaged by the Haftars, which is absolutely conceivable. I mean, can the Haftars manage things badly through overreach and stupidity? Sure. Can they fail in practice to fight well? Sure. But the international's instinct, by and large, based on my experience, which is limited in my time and place, it's not comprehensive. Never in doubt, often wrong is a phrase that people use. I am sometimes in doubt and wrong often enough. But having said that, the internationals default, well, who's the strong man who can bring security and put us in a situation where we can just go forward again? Well, there isn't anybody besides the Haftars who fill that role. So again and again, even back when I was in, even before Haftar had accumulated the power again, every day I had to say, could this guy do the whole thing and solve all our problems? And my answer was always, no, he can't, won't work, even if you wanted it to work. But people might conclude this time that it could work. And that's particularly true if Turkey decides to take that side, given the role Turkey played last time. Turkey's got relations with various militias in the Tripoli area and in Misrata. So if you can find Turkish Libyans, as it were, neo-Ottomanists, to line up on behalf of the Haftar family, I know that sounds strange.
Mhm.
I can imagine that being the default the internationals would move to more readily than I can imagine the default the internationals moving to is, let's get a fresh start, even if that's what the country needs. I apologize for that dark and surly answer, but that's what I believe. Thank you.
Okay, I want to take just a very quick minute to see if there are any other questions in the room. If any of our panelists would like to make any concluding remarks. Going once. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope it was useful for all of you. And also thank you very much to our speakers, Jonathan, Tim, Tarek. It's lovely to see you guys even remotely, hopefully next time in person. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for being with us this past hour and a half. So thank you very much.
Thank
Bye,
you, everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much for organizing this.